There's a product you buy repeatedly, yet you never hold it in your hands. It doesn't sit on shelves, it isn't manufactured in factories, and it requires no raw materials. Debt exists as a contract, a promise stretched across time, and that's what makes it different from any traditional good. When you purchase a physical product, the transaction ends. But with debt, the transaction begins a relationship. It generates ongoing payments, compounding returns, and long-term leverage, turning time itself into something that can be sold. Long before modern banks or credit cards, debt was already shaping civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, obligations were etched onto clay tablets, recording who owed grain, silver, or labor to whom. These early systems allowed trade to expand beyond immediate barter, but they also revealed a dangerous pattern. When too many citizens became trapped in unpaid promises, social stability began to fracture. Rulers periodically declared debt cancellations to prevent collapse, recognizing that while debt fueled growth, unchecked obligations could quietly destabilize entire societies. Lending slowly evolved from a simple economic convenience into a mechanism of influence. When merchants and early bankers began financing rulers, wars, and large trade ventures, money no longer followed power. Power began to follow money. Those who controlled credit could shape decisions without ruling directly. Monarchs depended on lenders to sustain armies and maintain authority, creating relationships where financial obligation translated into political leverage. Debt transformed into more than repayment. It became negotiation, dependency, and silent control, allowing creditors to influence outcomes without ever wearing a crown. A decisive shift occurred when borrowing moved from individuals to entire nations. Governments discovered they no longer needed to rely solely on taxation or treasure reserves. They could finance ambitions by promising future repayment. Bonds allowed citizens and investors to lend directly to the state, transforming debt into a permanent public institution rather than a temporary emergency measure. As central banking systems emerged to manage these obligations, national debt became normalized. States began operating on continuous borrowing, embedding credit into governance itself, and redefining how power, war, and economic expansion were sustained. As industrialization accelerated, debt moved beyond rulers and financiers into the machinery of everyday progress. Railways, factories, and large infrastructure projects required capital on a scale few individuals possessed, making borrowing the engine of expansion. Businesses grew through credit, wages flowed from debt-financed enterprises, and ordinary workers gradually entered the system themselves, borrowing to secure homes, tools, and opportunities. What began as a mechanism for funding industry quietly reshaped daily life, weaving debt into employment, consumption, and the emerging promise of modern economic participation. A profound psychological shift occurred when borrowing stopped being associated with hardship and became a symbol of participation in modern life. Banks and retailers began presenting credit as convenience rather than obligation, allowing households to access homes, cars, and comforts immediately while postponing payment into the future. Installment plans and revolving credit transformed debt into a routine experience, quietly redefining prosperity itself. Consumption no longer depended solely on earned savings. It depended on access to borrowing, embedding debt into daily decisions, and making financial obligation an ordinary condition of modern living. At a certain point, debt ceased to be merely an agreement between borrower and lender and became something far more abstract. Financial institutions discovered they could bundle loans together, transform them into securities, and sell those obligations to investors around the world. A mortgage or loan was no longer held until repayment. It became an asset that could be traded repeatedly. This innovation multiplied profits and expanded credit availability, but it also distanced risk from responsibility, turning debt itself into a commodity circulating endlessly through global financial markets. Periods of rapid borrowing have repeatedly ended in moments of sudden realization, when confidence collapses and hidden fragility surface. Financial crises exposed how interconnected obligations had become, revealing that debt assumed to be safe could unravel entire economies when repayment faltered. Markets froze, institutions struggled, and governments intervened to prevent wider collapse. Yet instead of dismantling reliance on borrowing, these crises often reinforced it, as recovery efforts relied on even greater lending. Each breakdown revealed systemic risk, while simultaneously deepening dependence on the very mechanism that caused instability. Today, borrowing is no longer an occasional tool used in emergencies. It has become the operating foundation of the global economy. Governments finance budgets through deficits, corporations expand through leverage capital, and households maintain living standards through credit access. Economic growth increasingly depends on new borrowing replacing old obligations, creating a system that requires constant expansion to remain stable. The paradox is clear. Repayment alone would slow the system itself. Debt now functions less as a temporary bridge and more as the continuous fuel sustaining modern economic momentum. When debt becomes permanent, its consequences extend far beyond finance. Interest payments gradually redirect wealth toward those who control capital, shaping economic hierarchies over generations. Access to cheap borrowing amplifies existing advantages, while costly debt limits mobility for others, quietly reinforcing inequality. Financial freedom begins to depend less on income and more on independence from continuous obligation. Over time, debt dominance influences political decisions, social structures, and personal choices, revealing that control over credit ultimately translates into control over opportunity, stability, and long-term autonomy.